social and economic life of Venezuela for generations, just as the indigenous people throughout Latin America had suffered that kind of treatment. To become the president, not out of motives of personal aggrandizement, but to transform the situation for the indigenous people of Venezuela and the poor and the working class overall. In the process, he inspired millions to new levels of consciousness, which was never more in evidence than in 2002 when they streamed down from the barrios in their thousands and tens of thousands after the coup was attempted to depose him. That documentary, we've all seen it, Revolution Will Not Be Televised, is never off my DVD player and never fails to bring a tear to my eye. The sight of the people outside the Miraflores Palace, preparatory to the Palace Guard mounting the counter-coup, which led to loyal elements within the army effecting Hugo Chávez's rescue. But one incident within that chain that was not depicted in the documentary, but which I think was the hinge upon which this event ended up, and the hinge upon which history turned in that event, involved a young bookler from the Palace Guard. When the new president, Pedro Carmona, the illegal president, the right-wing oligarch, was sworn in inside the palace, one of the army officers who was part of the coup emerged to where the Palace Guard were assembled. And he approached the bugler and he said, "The new president has just been sworn in, please sound the presidential introduction." And the bugler replied, "But Senor General, I already have a president, his name is Hugo Chávez." This to me was the key moment within that event, because if he had faltered at that precise moment, if he had hesitated, if his courage had deserted him, and he had acquiesced in the general's request and sounded the presidential salute, what would it have done to the rest of his comrades who shortly thereafter were to mount the counter-coup? Would it have changed, and would they have lost their courage, and would this whole event have changed for the worse? And was this young bugler's courage fortified in any way by the sight of tens of thousands of people outside the palace demanding the restitution and restoration of President Chávez to his rightful place? The reason I develop this point, because this is the interrelationship between the collective and the individual at key moments in history. And when it's in place, those movements become irresistible. And I developed this point because I have been fascinated with the treatment of Alexis Tsipras during this Greek crisis. A month ago, he was considered by many to be the man of the hour, to be in fact a great Hugo Chávez by many. Today, he is considered to be, by a large section of the left, to be nothing more than a cheese-eating surrender monkey, a cellist, a traitor. I don't think he was either a great Hugo Chávez, and I don't think he was a surrender monkey. I think his failure was in believing that he could walk into that negotiating room in Brussels with nothing more in his pocket except a democratic mandate. He undoubtedly capitulated. He's admitted that he capitulated, and as he said, the choice was between capitulation or disaster. And I tend to agree. I think he's been rather unfairly dealt with. I think it is wholly unrealistic to place responsibility for facing down the forces of global capital onto the shoulders of one man, one government, and one people who have suffered immeasurably over these last 5 years. In the last couple of weeks, the Greek banks have had to close, had to impose capital controls. The ECB had switched off the funding, and this had placed Greece into a liquidity crisis. Shortages of medicine, shortages of food were starting to be felt, and this placed Greece on the cusp of a full-blown humanitarian crisis. So he did emerge with nothing more than a deal which was tantamount to fiscal colonialism. But where he did succeed, and perhaps unwittingly, was in ripping off the mask of democracy from the face of the Eurozone. And I think this will have grievous consequences from the Eurozone going forward. I do not feel that I can any longer support the EU. I was someone who was ambivalent, leaning towards support for the EU on the basis that I thought United Europe was a good thing, where capitalism went, working class unity followed. This is clearly not the case. This is a beast that must be slain, and I think we need a left-wing campaign. I think Alexis Tsipras lacked in that room, and this relates to my initial remarks with regards to Venezuela, a mass movement, a Europe-wide mass anti-austerity movement to place pressure on all the Eurozone governments to know that they would pay a heavy price if they were to dictate the austerity terms which they did to the Greek people. To my mind, there should have been hundreds of thousands of people outside the venue where these talks took place in Brussels last week, spitting nails and holding these bastards to account, holding them hostage, no less. But I don't imply any criticism on the left because of this lack of a mass movement. On the contrary, I think the left in this country, where we are just now, has extended itself in trying to build such a movement. The mass demonstration that took place in London a couple of weeks ago was a huge success, organised by the People's Assembly. But as we know, as veterans of the anti-war campaign, this is a political class that is able to absorb mass movements and ignore them. 2 million people marched on the streets of London prior to the war in Iraq. In 2003, they went ahead anyway, and we all knew that they were not going to stop their plans for austerity on the basis of one demonstration. But Alexis Tsipras is not my enemy. Syriza is not my enemy. My enemy is the Troika and that juggernaut otherwise known as Neoliberalism, under whose wheels nothing is sacred, neither democracy, national sovereignty, or even humanity. And when it comes to this country, what was the fault of private greed and recklessness on the part of the banks has been turned into a crisis of public spending and the welfare state by the Tories, with the connivance of the Labour Party, which is a badge of shame for them. And speaking of shame, Harriet Harman, when you added your voice to this vile Tory policy of punishing children for daring to be born, you crossed a line from which you will never, ever recover. In fact, if you occupy any position in British politics, much less the interim leader of the Labour Party, shows you how far we have fallen. But we do have hope. My hope lies in the short term in the campaign of Jeremy Corbyn for Labour leadership. Everybody on the left, all progressive countries, must get behind this campaign for man and woman. Have you seen the way the mass media has struggled to cope with Jeremy Corbyn? I mean, can you believe the knots they've become twisted in trying to fathom how this man has been so successful? They start off by patronising him, and now they're trying to demonise him. That Hafra, Tashina Duru-Murphy, did you see the Channel 4 News interview last week? Or you sat down with Hezbollah and Hamas, you called them friends. Well, by that logic, the British government had no business sitting down with Irish Republicans and negotiating a peace process. It is madness. Marx talked about the idiocy of rural life. We must talk today, I think, about the idiocy of the mainstream media. Likewise, George Galloway's campaign, Ola endorsed that campaign. I'd like to add my endorsement to that campaign. George is the most unflinching, unapologetic, undefeated and principled anti-imperialist and anti-racist this country has ever produced, bar none. Imagine what you can do with a platform such as the Mayor of London, given what we know about his track record as a backbench MP. He will charge, he and Jeremy Corbyn together will be an irresistible force that will lead a counter-hegemonic movement. Finally, I don't want to take up too much time with 2 more speakers to come. What is austerity? Austerity is nothing more than a mass experiment in human despair. It is not an economic policy. In fact, it is economically illiterate. I don't think the interpretation of austerity that was given by Paul Krugman, the US Nobel laureate economist, can be better. He described it as a medieval witch doctor treating a patient who suffered severe blood loss by draining even more blood from the patient, thereby sending that patient to his death. We need an investment-led alternative to austerity. Let me put it another way. No business in this country has ever created one job. No businessman in this country has ever created one job. Businesses and businessmen do not create jobs. Consumers create jobs by spending money on goods and services to which businesses respond by either expanding or with new startups. There is a principle within Keynesian macroeconomics, if I may get technical for a moment, known as the marginal propensity to consume, which holds that the more disposable income you give people, the more money they will spend. And within that, the more you give to people on lower income, the more they will spend in proportion to people on higher incomes who receive more money. Why? Because they have needs which are not being met on the current level of income. Thereby, every penny they will get, they will spend in the local economy. Whereas people on higher incomes will either save that money or invest it because their needs are already being met. This makes it clear that our alternative should be an investment-led, redistributive policy. We should not be talking about cutting benefits. We should be talking about increasing benefits, Harriet, so that people have more money to spend and so that we can grow this economy and bring it out of recession. And in conclusion, may I just mention Yanis Varoufakis, a man who I have come to admire throughout this crisis, despite, I have to say, what John Pilger says, which I thought was a very good article in my opinion, from a man who I do also very much admire. But Yanis Varoufakis described this latest deal as a new Treaty of Versailles, and I agree, but what he neglected to say was, while the Treaty of Versailles marked the end of one conflict, it laid the seeds in the ground for the next. This struggle is far from over, and as the old Spanish communists used to say, defeat, 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 until the final victory. Thank you.
They're all demonized by mainstream media. And I think we've come to realize now that when mainstream media demonizes somebody, you know that they're doing something right. So that just goes to show. Now, our next speaker, you've obviously all seen him because he's one of the most watched broadcasters on the planet. His quotating critiques of the city, the banksters, the financial terrorists, the governments who serve them, and then go off to work for them. Absolutely breathtaking. He's innovative, original, pioneering. He breaks molds. He then goes off and makes new ones. He's American, but he's a good kind of American. He believes in freedom, in liberty, in honesty, transparency. So really, no wonder people were pretty upset when George Galloway announced that he'd make him his economic advisor. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll give you Max Kaiser.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to see you all again. A few faces I recognize from previous events. And the movement is growing. Support for Galloway is growing. And this Greek crisis, I wanted to talk about this Greek crisis and put it into historical perspective. Actually, you can say that it started back in the 1970s. Now, what was happening in the 1970s? There was an oil embargo, there was a crisis in America, and the stock market went into a 16-year bear market. Stocks were getting hammered. There was misery on Wall Street. Prices for energy were skyrocketing. And stock prices, in fact, got so low, they were year after year getting cheaper and cheaper. They got so bad that the assets that companies had on their books, the real estate, the factories, etc., were worth more than what the market was valuing these assets. So a very sharp businessman in Mayfair figured out something that he could borrow a bunch of money, buy a company, sell off those assets, and make an enormous profit. Now, that gentleman's name was Sir Jimmy Goldsmith. He invented the leveraged buyout. The leveraged buyout then swept the financial world with the help of Reagan and Thatcher and lower and lower interest rates. We entered an era of financialization driven by this technique, if you will, of the leveraged buyout, where you use the assets of the company you're going to take over as collateral for the loan. You secure the loan, you buy that company, sometimes in what's called a hostile raid, and then you split it up. and you sell those assets, and you fire lots of people. Now, this technique has also been used internationally. Most famously up until now, I would say, in the case of Argentina, where Citibank essentially loaned that country a lot of money and then proceeded to put that debt onto the government's balance sheet and then forced all manner of rapaciousness and asset stripping and wealth aggrandizement for a few. With Greece, this is the first time we've seen this leveraged buyout approach in Europe. Greece is the first country that's suffered a leveraged buyout from Wall Street, the City of London. I was in Athens just 3 years ago. I saw Steve Forbes, who's the son of Malcolm Forbes, who inherited the Forbes fortune, Forbes magazine. I mistakenly went into the wrong hotel. I saw Steve Forbes in the lobby. I was there covering the riots. And I said, Steve, what brings you to Athens with your parade of blacked out minivans? He's like, oh yeah, Max. I kind of vaguely knew him from his father, Malcolm. He used to party on his yacht down the Wall Street area when he was still, active. And he said, are you here for the asset sales? I said, no, tell me more, Steve. It's like, well, I'm here with the International Chamber of Commerce, and we're touring Greece right now. Because when this sucker blows, we're going to buy these assets for pennies on the dollar. It's a classic leveraged buyout. The toll booths, the shipping lanes, the lottery, everything that generates an income will be bought for pennies on the dollar. So flash forward now to 2015, we have the end result of the machinations of the banking system in the City of London and in New York. The cooperation, of course, of Lloyd Blankfein and Goldman Sachs, who fraudulently put Greece into the euro upon its inception. John Paulson, hedge fund manager, who we know from records, met up with Papandreou, former PM, who conveniently parked some gains in his mother's account made from a credit default swap that was profitable with the collapse of that bond market. To carve up the country, as you would on Wall Street in a hostile raid on a company. They have carved up Greece, and today the news is that Warren Buffett has bought an island, Johnny Depp bought an island, the assets are for sale. The loan of roughly $80 billion yet to be worked out will pale in comparison with the value of the assets once they're in private hands. It's $500 billion worth of assets that'll be owned by foreign bankers, Steve Forbes and his buddies. What'll happen to the people of Greece? Who cares? Nobody cares. They'll end up like the Indians of America, the indigenous population of America, put on reservations and starve to death. Nobody cares. And unfortunately, this wave of privatization, commodification, securitization, financialization is coming to the UK. The one thing that I think George Galloway has in his favor that nobody sees coming is that when the leveraged buyout era started in 1980, it was the beginning of a 25 to 30-year bull market, if you will, in bonds or interest rates. So interest rates have been getting cheaper for 30 years. That means that the price of doing these types of deals keeps getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper until, at the current stage, we have interest rates in Britain are now at a 300-year low. Interest rates in America are at a 240-year low, give or take. And this is a trend that has exhausted itself. Before this bull market started, it was a 16-year bear market in stocks. I think we're now at the end of this bull market, and we're seeing, and we're going to be entering a new period of rising interest rates, which will throw a monkey wrench into this housing bubble that you see here in the UK, and will usher in a new era. And it needs new leadership. So I think that Mr. Galloway, in one respect, his timing is excellent, because this population, this country, is going to be looking for a way out of what I see very quickly as being a financial collapse. which is long overdue. There's only so much money printing you can do to prop up a failed system before it blows up. The UK bond market is purchased by the UK government. The US bond market is purchased by the US government. European bonds are purchased by the European government. These are not self-sustaining governments, countries. Mark Carney, the current Bank of England chairman, said when he came into office he was going to engineer some escape velocity for this economy, that there would be enough growth to generate enough taxes to pay down the debt. Well, what's happened to the debt since Osborne came in? It's almost doubled. It's roughly 1.4 trillion pounds. The deficit off a little, not really in a meaningful way. The debt is continuing to expand. Wages in real terms are flat to deteriorating. Productivity, the current account deficit, which weighs the trade imbalances and other factors, is it's the worst in the G20. It's at 6% of GDP. This economy under the surface is in terrible shape. And when this bubble pops, as I believe we are in the midst of witnessing, new leadership will step forward. This is what happens in a crisis. The leaders that were running the place exit, and new leaders emerge. Now, in my view, Mr. Galloway is a guy who is somebody you hand the ball to when the going gets tough. And not only that, if people say figuratively, they'll fight for you. But how many politicians are actually go out into the street and get beat up? How many actually do get into a fight? You know, how many? This is not a metaphor for Mr. Galloway. He'll actually fight, which I like. And I think everyone will appreciate that in the ensuing months. And now I'm going to turn it over to the next mayor of this fine city of London, who I'm very happy about because it's right next to where we record the show. So when I'm short of a guest, I'm going to pop over and demand he comes on the show. I give you George Galloway.
Thank you very much, Hafsa, and my honourable friends, John, Councillor Oliver, and the incomparable Max. Thank you to the Venezuelan ambassador and her councillor who's with us for the use of this wonderful hall. Thank you for coming to this meeting this evening, and to those watching on Periscope. Don't ask me what Periscope is, but a very considerable number of people are watching this meeting on it, and many others will in the course of time, thanks to the wonders of YouTube. There are some phrases which stick to the wall in meetings such as this, and Max just threw out one of them. He might have meant it as just something in the passing, but it stood out for me as a metaphor for the entire picture that we're seeking to describe and illuminate here this evening. Are you here? Are you here for the asset sales, Max? Said the multi-billionaire Mr. Forbes. Are you here for the asset sales, Max? Doesn't that describe the world of piratical, vulture capitalists that have beggared most of the planet and now are beggaring our own continent and our own country? The asset sales are, of course, sales of the wealth which the people, in this case of Greece, have spent millennia, in Greece's case, building up. I saw a meme the other day of the Acropolis turned into a McDonald's drive-by. I laughed at first, and then I thought, I hope they haven't given them ideas. When they're buying up the islands, They're buying up the other assets of Greece. Why not the priceless archaeological treasures too? Why not monetize everything? After all, as Marx predicted, capitalism would be an era in which not only all that is sacred is profaned, but all that is solid will melt into air. Isn't that what we are watching now? That which is solid melting into air, everything that's sacred being profaned. If you'll allow me a slight digression, mainly because I've issued a press release which requires me now to say it, I'd like to comment briefly on the Prime Minister's speech today. It only needs to be brief. The Prime Minister has identified a crisis in identification with Britain of some British Muslims. I've just got to say this, Prime Minister. If you want to encourage Muslims to identify with Britain, stop going around the world bombing them, killing them, occupying Muslim countries, looting them. Stop arming Israel. This very week, the ridiculously insubstantial restrictions which the Ministry of Defense had placed after several Israeli massacres in Gaza, restrictions that say, if I remember correctly, that the weapons that we're selling you must not be used for either external aggression or internal repression, which I always thought begged the question, well, what's the point of the weapons if they can't be used for external aggression or internal repression? But that absurd condition was this week lifted, and Britain declared a free-for-all in weaponizing one of the most brutal occupations in modern times. So if you want British Muslims to identify with Britain, you have to stop the wars, stop backing Israel, and stop propping up the Muslim tyrants who rule the Muslim countries, almost without exception, from one end to the other. But of course, the real traitors in our midst are not the young Muslim fulminating as he watches the news at the carnage being sown across the world. The real traitors to our country are the people who brought us to our knees, and the people who have been complicit in the bringing of the Greek people not just to their knees, but now